Do it over. We'll start it from here.
Okay.
Welcome, everyone, to our podcast, the first episode of our podcast that we're filming. And my name is Ryan. I'm here with my co-host, Lavit. We are both people who work in the social justice industrial complex, and our podcast is all about talking about and discussing and trying to figure out that the social justice industrial complex, the industry we both work in. Welcome, everybody. And on this episode, we're talking to Freddie deBoer. Freddie is a very, I think, well-known writer on the left and, at least the radical left in North America. And he has a Substack, which is just Freddie deBoer, Freddie spelled with an IE.substack.com. Back in May, Freddie had written on his Substack an article called The Gentrification of Disability. I read it, Lavit read it. We both were really impressed by it. We had a lot of thoughts about it. It's not unique in Freddie's body of work for being something that is both really original but also really lucid, and where thoughts that you've had are kind of articulated more clearly and more memorably by Freddie than one would probably be able to do on your own.
I really, really felt so incredibly lucky to talk to Freddie yesterday. Like you said, he's such a eloquent way of saying things that I wish I could say. It is controversial and it's an uncomfortable topic for, I think, most people for good reason. It should be uncomfortable because it is, what I want to clarify is like what we're talking about is a last resort for people who are at like the very last margins of, mental illness and severe disability.
So Freddie deBoer, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for coming on the podcast. Lavit, do you want to maybe kind of start with talking about why we wanted to have Freddie here?
Yeah, sure. So I just found your piece really meaningful, specifically with the type of work that Ryan and I do, working with, really vulnerable communities that are really suffering. There was not one part of what you said that I didn't agree with literally 100%. Like Daniel Bergner's piece in the New York Times, which was sent to me by multiple people, asking me what I thought. And I was like, this is such bullshit, and so deeply dangerous and irresponsible to write a piece like this. So, so that's why we really wanted to talk to you.
Yeah. Maybe just to kind of start. So the piece went up on your Substack a couple of weeks ago, and what has the response been like since then?
There's been a big response. It got a lot of views, at least in the context of my newsletter. I got, I would say it's 3/4 very positive, another quarter very negative. The most obvious thing is that I can't tell you how many people have emailed me to say that they themselves suffer from a mental illness, a serious mental illness, or they have a family member who suffers from a serious mental illness, and they were happy to read what I wrote because they feel very deeply alienated because of what has become of the culture and philosophy behind mental illness in the United States right now. And the people who were mad for predictable reasons. They endorse that sort of ideology. I think one thing that maybe I should have done a better job of, and will do a better job of right now, is there really are two sort of distinct communities that I'm reacting to that share a lot of overlap, but I think that you should sort of see them in two different ways, which is there is the anti-psychiatry movement, which is decades old. It's larger than people think. It has considerable influence in a lot of places. So the single most the mental health expert who has been served as an expert witness in more trials than anyone else in psychiatry is someone called Dr. Peter Breggin, who is sort of, if the anti-psychiatry movement has one champion, that's him. He's someone who thinks that quite explicitly that psychiatric medication is inappropriate in all contexts and for any reason. He is very prominent online community around him. And so he's the most cited legal expert on this topic. And he is someone who was part of, what the anti-psychiatry movement's more sort of cultist sort of element to me. So this is like a mainstream phenomenon, which is something that I constantly have to remind people of. There's a sort of anti-psychiatry movement, which goes back to Ken Casey and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest and Thomas Szasz. And, but there's also now a sort of a social justice element to this, which is there has been a sort of coalescing of various strains of academic disability studies ideas, which center on the idea of the validity of the individual and the things that they feel, and that the urge to correct mental illnesses is in some ways to demand that people be untrue to themselves, etc. So those things are overlapping, though separate. In any case, one of the things I have to keep telling people keep saying to me, oh, you're just mad about teens on TikTok who are being annoying. This is just an internet phenomenon. And that is not correct. I will insist that is not correct. I have been in psychiatric treatment of various kinds for 20 years. And the fundamental approach, the vocabulary, the ethos of what I'm experiencing, from doctors, in institutions, in group therapy, in one-on-one therapy, in support groups, is quite different. And there's a lot of people who are very alienated from this. And the core of the alienation is they or their loved ones have had their lives repeatedly, deeply damaged by their mental illness. And the relentless insistence that there is something more valid or more real or deeper about the mentally ill self is insulting to me and insulting to them. And so I was happy to hear from so many people who felt the same way.
I just want to let you know, Freddie, that that is something that mental health professionals are experiencing a lot in the field as well, especially when you're working with the most sick, as opposed to what we call the worried well, right? So a phenomenon that my team has been experiencing quite a bit lately are activists filming when we do an involuntary hold, demanding private health information of the people we're working with, calling it carceral psychiatry, which is the word that they use now, putting their information on the internet. And just, it's, deeply humiliating for the people experiencing it, which I try and explain to them, this is literally the worst day of their lives. Why would you do this? Deeply humiliating and unfair to the families of people who are suffering. And, the individuals that we work with are, they're very much languishing, because of they're prisoners of their own delusions. Right. And they kind of romanticize the illness that they have. Just because they don't live the way you want them to live, you're going to punish them. This is another form of punishment. And it's really frustrating.
I think one of the things that, the ways that this sort of enrages me the most is that this ideology helps to contribute to the perception that the problem with psychiatric medicine is there's too much of it, right? That too many people are getting treated. Whereas if you have a job like you have, right, you are well aware that the problem for the vast majority of people is inadequate access to medicine, right? It's not that they're being over-treated. That is not a problem. So just to throw a few numbers around, 2/3 of psychiatrists in the United States don't take Medicaid. So you're saying the poorest people who have Medicaid, good luck. Better than 40%, more than 40% of practicing psychiatrists in the United States don't take commercial insurance at all. So if you have Aetna through your employer, better than 40% of practicing psychiatrists don't take it, right? Because I'm not sure if people are aware of this. As a general statement, psychiatric medicine in the United States is rich people's medicine. There's an entire constellation of treatment and facilities and doctors that exist purely for those who are affluent enough to access them. Also, psychiatry, like a lot of medical care, is deeply geographically concentrated in a few places, so that something like 2/3 of counties in the United States of America do not have a single practicing psychiatrist in them, right? So right off the bat, and you can add to this, all of the various vagaries of the American medical system writ large, right? And the medical insurance system. I tell people this all the time. The concept of go get help, right? You need to go get help, implies that there is some place that people can go to get help, right? And I have to constantly let people know there is no magical facility where you can show up and say, I'm having a psychiatric crisis, and you can be assured to receive appropriate care that won't bankrupt you. Many of the state mental health facilities have been shut down through the process of deindustrialization over the last 50 years. Even those state facilities, so in my hometown in Connecticut, there's Connecticut Valley Hospital, which is like the big psychiatric facility in Connecticut. You can't just walk up to the door and say to them, I'm sick, I need help. And they'll say, oh, come on in here. You need a referral. Oftentimes needing a referral requires going to the emergency room. You will be forced to pay for that visit. Okay. If you go to an emergency room and you don't have insurance and you say, I'm in desperate psychiatric conditions, I need to go to a facility, just that ER visit will be in the thousands of dollars out of your pocket, and you will be billed for it. People are very afraid of being involuntarily committed, so oftentimes they won't pursue that because that's much more likely in the scenario where you're going to an ER. It's also the case that there's many documented cases of people who were involuntarily committed and their insurance company still declined to pay for the charges. So you get sick, you get taken to the ER, you are declared to be a danger to yourself or to others, you go into a facility, and hopefully in that facility you receive the care that you need. And then when you emerge and you're ready to begin your life again, you discover you have a $30,000 bill from your stay at that facility, right? So conceiving of the problem as being a problem of too much care in and of itself is a lie, and it's a destructive lie, and one that makes me very angry. The thing that always gets to me is I am very well read in criticisms of psychiatric medicine. I'm deeply aware of the philosophical backings of the anti-psychiatry movement. And there are absolutely, I myself have experienced lots of things that are wrong with the system. What bothers me is how many people are convinced that the system is wrong but can't articulate anything like a coherent, evidence-based critique of why that is, who don't know what they would put in its place. I mean, this is, I've made this challenge to people before. Go out and invent a psychiatric medication, like make one up. Go out into the street and poll people and say, hey, here's this psychiatric medicine, fake effects or whatever we want to call it. Is that overprescribed? I guarantee you large majorities of people say, oh yeah, that stuff, it's terrible, right? Because it is so deeply ingrained in people, like this idea that psychiatric medicine is bad and destructive. And all of this is happening in the background of conditions that by their nature make many people treatment adverse. And so it is just powerfully unhelpful to the most vulnerable to be creating this culture that insists based on nothing, that we have too little psychiatric medicine when in fact many, many people die because they never have access.
Yeah, all of that is something I see on the ground daily. I mean, it's so very, very real. In fact, what's so crazy is that we actually have to work on sometimes keeping our clients uninsured. Like we won't sign them up for Medi-Cal because we have special contracts. I work for the county, and Medi-Cal is so shitty that like it's better for them to be uninsured to receive that level of care that they need because they are so gravely disabled and destitute. So it's like almost like no insurance makes things less complicated. I can't help but think that like some of this is actually by design from kind of these big insurance companies, or like to take the heat off of us to actually create a system of care and mental health infrastructure for people who really need it, and to just excuse it as like, well, you know, who are you to judge the way that these people live? So to keep people from having access to care, to keep people from making these kind of structural changes in the way that people receive care and access to care, it's almost like these people who have these ideas are kind of feeding into this plan to just make it unavailable and keep things the way they are, status quo.
Yeah, I mean, and I don't even know that we need to like posit like a maybe explicit conspiracy. There's no doubt that psychiatric patients offer a strange profile to insurance companies, where on the one hand, there are few, genuinely expensive operations, so to speak, within psychiatric medicine. You might get ECT, you might get transcranial magnetic, whatever it is, the transcranial thing. But even those aren't that as expensive as like getting shoulder surgery or something like that. Yeah. So the short-term individual costs tend not to be that high. I mean, most patients receive talk therapy if they're lucky, and group therapy, and an antipsychotic in an inpatient facility, and are then, have weekly psychiatrist meetings in which they might transfer to a different, eventually to a different drug, etc. Those things aren't particularly expensive. The problem is that there is at least a perception that mental health care is chronic, lifelong care. That, in other words, the guy who gets shoulder surgery, that's going to be tens of thousands of dollars out of the pocket of the insurance company. But once he gets shoulder surgery, he'll get some fairly cheap physical therapy, and then he's done. He does not have a chronic rest of his life problem. The perception certainly is that people who have serious mental illnesses are cursed to have them their whole lives. Now, that's actually a misconception. So this is another thing I point out to people all the time. A majority of people who are treated for serious mental illnesses have a period in which they're struggling in that way. They receive care, they receive therapy and medication, and they are gradually transitioned off of that, and they go into remission, and they never have another problem again. So, and I think this is like super important for people to understand. For most people receiving mental health care, it works the way that any other medicine does, which is that you see a doctor, you receive appropriate care, and then eventually you transition off of that care. The large majority of people who take antipsychotics don't take it more than for a couple of years at the most. Okay, I'm not one of them. I've been on antipsychotics off and on for 20 years, and I've been on it consistently for 5 years. And there are people like me who have chronic problems. But defining mental health care as something that you are cursed to have to do for the rest of your life in a way that's not true if you break your leg, I think is unhelpful. But certainly that's the perception. And so you have the idea of, number one, we know that mental health care patients, for a variety of reasons, have lower incomes, have less steady employment, are more likely to be unable to pay copays, etc. They're also perceived to be people who will be in and out of institutions for the rest of their lives. It's just not a very attractive prospect compared to a lot of things. And then again, there is this whole, sort of system of white glove psychiatric medicine, which almost none of which takes insurance, which is very appealing to the doctors who do it because they can charge a lot of money, and they generally don't work with the most violent patients, the most disturbed patients, the most difficult to treat patients. So I was in a psychiatrist's office once, and there was a bunch of brochures around, and there was a brochure for a facility that, in addition to like the tennis courts and the pool and stuff, it advertised 24-hour concierge service for patients, right? But it said very clearly on the brochure, we take no insurance, right? Because they don't, they don't want those patients, right? It's like the whole point is to screen out the transient patients, the homeless patients, the patients who have, comorbidities of alcoholism or drug addiction or whatever. So yeah, it's not a population that is particularly attractive from the standpoint of insurance companies. It's not a population that's particularly attractive from the standpoint of doctors. I've often complained about getting therapy as someone with a psychotic disorder. Look, therapists fairly say that it's hard in general to charge insurance for them, that they don't get paid adequately by insurance. And that's the whole thing for anybody. Therapy is, I'm in New York City. It's like the heart of therapy world here. And yet I can never find a therapist. It's such a hard time because you have to find someone who is on your insurance, who is taking new patients, and who can see you in a schedule that works for you. But the other thing is that a lot of therapists just don't want to work with patients with psychotic disorders. And what they will always say is, and I've been told this at least a half dozen times in my life, we think you should find a therapist who better fits your needs, right? Because there are people whose experience is in, divorcing housewives with depression, or kids who have ADHD and need Adderall or whatever. And I appreciate them trying to find the best doctor I can find, but there's just so many people in the therapy profession who just don't want to deal with a psychotic disorder. It's just not, they just don't see any upside to it. But they will charge my insurance after our intake appointment, by the way. So yeah, there is not a structure in place to make the sort of transitions from emergency acute care to long-term care that should exist. And part of the tragedy here is, this is something that I think is one of those things like I wish was taught in high school history classes that wasn't. But, we had a deinstitutionalization movement in this country. So in 1963, the last major law that John F. Kennedy ever signed was a big omnibus healthcare bill. And it began the process of deinstitutionalization. And it did so. I mean, look, there were some very bad conditions at a lot of the major state hospitals. There were people who were being warehoused there who were not being routinely assessed for whether they were ready to return to the world. There was inadequate services for them. Some of those places were very bleak. But as is so often the case, they began the process of dismantling the institutions, and they didn't build anything to replace it. So, the bill itself says, we're going to build community health, mental health centers everywhere. And those will be these sort of go-betweens, and they'll function as a sort of in-between space between acute care and going back home. And of course, they did close the institutions, but they never built the community health centers. I mean, even in that bill, they only set aside $130 million for the creation of a nation of community mental health centers, which even in 1963 dollars, it's a very paltry sum compared to what they were closing down. The belief was, well, if we close down the local and state institutions, that money will go to the community. But of course, that's not actually how it works. So there's just, I think the average person believes that there is some such place that you can just go to and receive mental health care when you need it. And that just literally does not exist for many people. And where to take someone who really needs the help is a powerful problem for a lot of people.
It's probably, like a lot of things, probably better up here, but still wildly inadequate. I used to do kind of the public disability benefits cases where you're trying to get somebody on. I think it's like Social Security disability in the US kind of. And we would often have clients who had mental health issues and they'd just been diagnosed by their family doctor. And like the application package was supposed to kind of include specialist reports or whatever. And it would just say, waiting for a psychiatrist, referred to psychiatrist, waiting for the psychiatrist, or referred to psychotherapy, which I don't know if that's like a thing in the US, but like it kind of, they're like non-medical therapists, and like a lot of them, then they don't take insurance. The public health system often doesn't pay for it in the same way here. So you would have, and then you'd get to the hearing where it's trying to determine if somebody's going to access these benefits, which are really crucial for getting, like the welfare rate is so low and it's like doubled if you're on disability. So it's still abysmally low, but like it's a huge difference in people's lives. And then like the adjudicator will be kind of criticizing the fact that it's all been done by the family doctor, but the stats you had about psychiatrists blew my mind. I think it's probably pretty similar here. Mm-hmm. They have to take, if you're a doctor, you can't not or you pretty much can't refuse to take public health care, which is each province has its own plan here. But I'd imagine there's a million dodges to basically operate the same kind of white glove type practice that you were describing.
Yeah, I mean, look, there is, if someone doesn't want to treat a particular class of patient, they're not going to. I mean, this is the basic reality. For a lot of psychiatrists, they will sort of do a early career few years in a program that really serves vulnerable populations, and then they get to graduate out of that. Then again, it's like whether you're talking about psychiatrists or therapists or anybody. I mean, you can just think about it yourself. If you were a talented, young person with a degree from Columbia, and you're going to be a psychiatrist or you're going to be a therapist, do you want to have your patients be, successful upper middle class professionals who live very stable lives and who have legitimate problems? I would never question the legitimacy of their psychiatric problems or what they need to work out with their therapist, but they're the kind of people who will be doing this regularly for years or decades because they go to therapy as part of their whole deal. Or you can do patients who never have any money, keep losing their jobs. Because they keep losing their jobs, keep losing their insurance, don't have the wherewithal to make sure that they can take advantage of Medicaid or the exchanges or whatever else, the affordances to get that kind of thing. Their paperwork is always a mess. They drop out and you don't see them for months and then they reappear, right? The barriers are there that are obvious, and there's just no incentive to see them, right? And so what you end up happening is, again, there are still state psychiatric facilities, some of them, but you had the sort of mushrooming of private facilities, which vary considerably in the level of care that they give, but where again, you gotta pay or you gotta go. Unless there is specifically a judge's hold ordering that you be held in a facility, right? So it varies a lot from state to state, but most states have a 72-hour hold is the basis of the involuntary commitment sort of system. In other words, a doctor can in most places can say you need to go into psychiatric facility for 3 days and you can't leave. The specifics of how long you have to stay after that and who can force you to stay depends a great deal on the state. In many places, the doctors essentially have carte blanche to keep you there. So if you're someone who gets into the system and you've been involuntarily committed, and you don't have someone on the outside who is really advocating for you and getting on the phone and showing up to the facility and saying, where is this person? What's the treatment plan? When can they get out? Et cetera. It's very easy in most places for you to just sort of get rolled along. Now, I say all that as someone who I had my life saved by involuntary commitment, right? And I think that I think that it is wrong to say that. I guess what I would say is, it's always possible for things to be bad in two ways at once, right? Mm-hmm. So in other words, there is both a problem. It is true that some people get pulled into the system and can't get out, and they don't have advocates. And they are, again, these are generally people who are just not very put together in terms of their overall grasp on life and self-responsibility and stuff, because they have a lot of really deep problems, including mental health issues. And so it can be difficult for them to get out. That does happen. It does exist. But there are so many people whose lives would have been saved if they had been involuntarily committed. And we need to understand that the other problem also exists, which is when people know someone is a danger to themselves, but there's no legal mechanism in place to get them into treatment, right? And I don't mean to generally, right, this is somebody who goes and kills themselves because nobody was able to force them into an institution. And we never hear about it because they are a random person with mental illness, probably a homeless person, probably a drug addict or an alcoholic. So that doesn't make the headlines. But you can think of two people which were specifically identified as suffering from mental illness and dangers to others, who somehow fell through the system. There was no one who could compel them to get care. One is James Holmes, who shot up the movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and killed 12 people. The other is Sung Hoi Cho, who was the Virginia Tech killer who killed 32 people and then killed himself. Right? They were both flagged by people at their universities who said this person is mentally ill. They were evaluated. They were found to be considered to be dangerous, and then just nobody knows what happened. Right? James Holmes called a mental health crisis line right before he shot up that theater, and he was disconnected after 9 seconds. So he went and he just shot it up. So these are instances of cases where other people's lives would have been saved had we had a more consistent and meaningful system that can, when absolutely necessary, compel people to seek treatment long enough that they don't take their own lives or the other lives of others. And even if we just want to think in terms of patient rights rather than everybody else, James Holmes was a absolutely classic schizophrenic. Everything about his case fit the etiology of the disease. He developed the exact symptoms that you would expect at exactly the age in which this tends to happen. He was, again, multiple people in his life flagged him as someone who was starting to suffer from severe paranoid delusions. And so it's not just the 12 people that he killed and the 70 other that he shot, but he might be living a, stable life right now, rather than spending the rest of his life in a maximum security prison, had we had a more aggressive system. So it's a very thorny question. If I had not been involuntarily committed, I'm sure that I would have killed myself. I have often made choices that are designed specifically to avoid the possibility of being involuntarily committed, because it's never going to happen to me again. So it was complicated, and I totally understand people who have gone through that and are very bitter and upset about it. But it simply is not the case that we have this ultra aggressive involuntarily commitment system that forces people into care all the time, because far too many people fall through the cracks.
Yeah. So my experience with the people that I serve is because they're basically have no support system in place of people that can advocate for them, they're basically triaged to their death. Like you said, the deinstitutionalization movement, we have no beds, and we kind of triage the very few beds that we do have. And we kind of make the choice, well, you're just a little sicker than this person. And then people will die. I've seen it, discharge people and they had a medical thing going on that their delusions, didn't allow them to seek care, and they die. I used to work specifically for the crisis team that would respond to homes. People would call. We see a lot of, it's just statistically young men that were kind of experiencing their first psychotic break. And we would write a hold. And a big barrier to care actually in that scenario too was that, we would have to call law enforcement. It's just the way it works. People don't like to hear that, but it's true. I cannot, I show up and they look at me, they're like, I'm not going to listen to you, you idiot, so, but more often than not is the case is that law enforcement will literally say to the person, well, that's their decision, not ours. We think you're fine.
Right.
And completely just ruin everything, make things worse, escalate. I have lost count of how many times we have had to leave homes with, families crying, saying but you said they need to go to the hospital. And I say, yeah, I did. They do need to go to the hospital, but I can't force them onto the gurney. I don't have that power to do it. I'm a 5'3" social worker. That's why I called law enforcement, and I'm sorry that they just left. But, that's kind of the trend that I see more than anything. And
I would also add from long experience, the emergency room experience is not great if you're going for mental health care. So I think another thing is if somebody's in crisis, they should just go to the ER. I've been in that position many times. So I had to get dragged into care. Literally, physically. I was having a meltdown at a neighbor when when I was 20 years old, and the cops showed up and they took me to the ER and they stuck me with Haldol and they shipped me off to a facility. And that's how I got diagnosed. There are moments when you are cognizant of the fact that you are losing control and where you are receptive to the idea of treatment, but getting into treatment is very hard. And I can tell you that I've been 6 or 7 times to the ER, whether brought myself or by someone else. The average ER does not want you there if you are a psychiatric patient. Okay, so the ERs can be immensely unwelcoming places. In general, either you're in the position that I was the first time I showed up at an ER, brought there by the cops, and so obviously psychotic that they simply injected me with injectable antipsychotics and shipped me to a facility, right? They like that outcome. Or they like if you refuse care and leave, right? They tend to think that you are just filling beds for no reason. Triage nurses, I'm sure being a triage nurse is very hard, and I have respect for the profession, but in general, triage nurses hate you as like an ambulatory psychiatric patient, right? But this happens all the time. People show up at the ER. They are on the very edge. They say, this is my chance to save my own life. And they show up there and they meet a triage nurse who is completely disdainful of their problems, who asks them if they've tried calming down, who say things like, do you think maybe you should speak to clergy? They don't want you taking up beds. And so what they do is the first thing that they'll often do is they'll put you on ice. Okay. So I have sat for in excess of 7 hours in an ER waiting to be treated while people come in and keep getting shuffled in ahead of you because the triage nurse doesn't want to deal with you. And that is valuable for them, not just because it keeps the bed open, but also because they're expecting you to eventually get up and leave. And if you get up and leave, then that's considered to be refusing treatment, and they're not on the hook if you go and you kill yourself, right? Like there's no malpractice risk if they just make you wait in the waiting room until you check out. And what's happening is everybody who goes to the ER for a psychiatric crisis has a voice in the back of their head saying, you're being ridiculous. This is stupid. Like you're being weak. You need to toughen up. And so you have this incredibly essential moment where you're cognizant enough to know I'm losing it. I need help. But there's a part of your brain that's telling you, shut up, whatever, go home, you'll be fine. And that voice works on you for all those hours that you sit there. So you're there for 2, for 3, for 4 hours, waiting in an empty ER, and you're working on yourself the whole time. And so either you get up and leave and their problem is solved, or you go and you see the ER shrink, who again, like the ER shrink wants people who he or she can give a shot of Haldol to and ship on the way out, because that's easy. It's clean. If it's somebody that they have to talk to, right, and like sort of arrange like an actual care plan, that can get complicated in terms of malpractice, etc. So when they see you and you are not someone who is clearly about to jump off a building, again, they play the same role, which is to sort of say, oh, you look really tired. Have you gotten any sleep? You should, maybe you should abstain from any alcohol this weekend and try to get some rest. Find a good friend. They will do things that are intentionally designed to minimize your situation, because again, you then say, okay, well, I guess I was fine. I overreacted. Thanks, doc. And they can put refused care, and they're no longer on the hook for anything, right? So you have these incredibly important moments where the ER system is just designed. They want heart attacks and broken ankles, right? Like that is what they define as their purpose. And psychiatric medicine is, again, like the easiest thing in the world in the ER, because the patients are people who are so far gone that you can just stick them with Haldol and ship them off. Then let's say you can get this doctor to take you seriously. They're not going to prescribe you anything, and probably wouldn't be appropriate to prescribe you anything that was actually going to treat your condition, because they don't want to diagnose you, right? The ER shrink absolutely does not want to say, oh, you're bipolar, right? They want that to be fobbed off on somebody else. So you can you'll get a referral to an outpatient psychiatrist, or simply a edict, go find an outpatient psychiatrist. And they might give you a script for a mild sedative like hydroxyzine or something. So now you are still someone who is suffering from a psychiatric crisis. All of the problems are still there. Now you have to navigate the American health system. You have to find a psychiatrist. You have to find one that takes your insurance, and you better hope that they have an appointment available in the next month. And often they don't. It can be months, I mean, I went to Staten Island. It was in Staten Island's Richmond University Medical Center, and they have a separate psychiatric ER, so that was nice. I didn't have a good sort of experience there, but as a condition of release, they said you got to go see our social worker. So I had to go back to Staten Island. I had only gone to Staten Island in the first place because my younger brother came to rescue me, and he got on the phone and figured out that this place would take my insurance, right? So I go back to Staten Island, and I'm living in Brooklyn, and so it's between the train and the ferry, it's like an hour and a half or more. And I show up there and I say, okay, well, you can see one of our shrinks. Your appointment will be next whatever. And I said, well, I can't come to Staten Island every time I need to see my psychiatrist in perpetuity. I live in central Brooklyn. It's hour and a half journey here, or else it's a $60 Uber. And they said, oh, sorry, I can't help you. And they put refused care on my thing, right? And so there's no, the ERs are not set up for this. The staff at ERs don't want to deal with this. And the transition, it's just not, again, you can't just find a mental health hospital, a psychiatric facility, and show up at the door and say, ta-da. They'll say, where's your referral? Who's sending you? Whatever. And so just all along the chain, there are barriers. And what ends up happening is that the people who don't receive care, because they can't get over these barriers, eventually they do get to the point of being actually actively totally psychotic and delusional. And then they do get the shot of Geodon and on the way to the facility thing. It's a terribly wasteful system. And there's so many people who get caught in that place where I am in a psychiatric crisis and I know it, but it's not presenting as sufficiently dangerous to the system that I get pulled into the system. And there continues to be, even among experienced psychiatrists, there's the whole attitude of, well, if you know that you're in a psychiatric crisis, are you really in one? And the answer to that is, yeah, motherfucker, I know I've been in one. I've been doing this for 20 years, all right? I know what this is like. I'm asking you to save my life right now. It's very, very, very frustrating.
So, Freddie, one question that I was, earlier you were talking about how in the 20 years that you've been dealing with this, you've kind of noticed a shift, if I got that right. Yep. And this kind of relates to your article. I guess my question is, what do you what if it was there kind of a triggering event for the shift, or is it more just kind of a bunch of things between the other?
I think it's been gradual. I mean, to me, right, I would define the change as the assumption that psychiatric medicine has as its fundamental purpose protecting and validating the perspective of the psychiatric patient. That, the way it's the idea that what I need from my therapist is for them to function as a hype man for me and to tell me that everything that I feel is a legitimate feeling, for psychiatrists to constantly tell me, you shouldn't feel bad about having a mental illness. It's not your fault. It's nothing shameful, great. Thank you. But I don't want a mental illness, right? I would love to not have this thing. What I need is effective medication and therapeutic techniques that help me to manage it so that it doesn't ruin my life. And I am someone who is personally frankly, a little insulted by the approach to psychiatric medicine that acts as if like I need to constantly be pandered to and told that I'm valid and that I'm good, et cetera, et cetera. Like you let me handle my validity, right? You help me keep from becoming manic again and once again coming to believe that members of my family are hacking my bank account, or that an ex-girlfriend I haven't seen in 10 years is putting glass in my food, right? Like those are the sort of things that I develop over time. And it's like, it's just the sense that, this is such a trivial and weird little thing to point out. But I was looking at the back of a cereal box recently, and it was just filled with these, for no reason, these like slogans like "You're gonna crush this day," you're a badass, you're becoming your truest self. And I'm like, when did my like management of my ego become everybody's business, right? And I it's not, and this isn't just like an aesthetic or style thing for me either, because the therapeutic process is often antagonistic by design, right? Like it is often the case that you need to be told as a psychiatric patient that the things that you believe are not correct, right? The absolute last thing I need to be told is, oh yeah, those feelings that you're feeling of absurd paranoia, right? My feelings that I'm being bugged, my feelings that I'm being watched, my feelings that I'm being followed, my feelings that people are conspiring against me. Those should not in any sense be humored, because they are not correct, right? And my response to them is destructive and sometimes quite violent, right? But it's just become baked into the cake of the whole therapeutic approach now. It's just that like, people are just forever telling you you're good, you're valid. I'm an adult, okay? And I have a serious psychotic disorder. I don't need you to tell me that I'm valid, right? I need you to act as my doctor or my therapist and help me to manage symptoms. And it's I think a good contrast is 12-step programs and Alcoholics Anonymous. I have my issues with those. I did spend a year going to AA meetings. I was never really working the steps or whatever. And I'm an atheist, and it's very churchy, and there's things about it, questions about it. But I think a thing to like about it is that the whole 12-step thing is actually, no, your natural instinct is not good. Your natural instinct is to be an addict. Your natural instinct is to drink yourself into a stupor. These things hurt you and the people around you, and you must change, right? And so, of course, if you investigate a little bit, you will find that there are these social justice critiques of Alcoholics Anonymous that center on this idea that, well, they're telling people that they're invalid, right? But they're not saying that they're invalid. They are saying that their instincts are invalid because their instincts are killing them, right? And I would just, but it filters out into everything. I'm in. I have a psychiatrist who is a 35-year veteran who I love, and he doesn't have any of this nonsense. I do, have done therapy in recent years, including outpatient group therapy, which is fairly rare. But those are very much these sort of things. I do online support groups. And look, support groups are for support. I'm not here to judge anyone. But there just is so much of this mistaken perception that, like, the point is to validate the individual rather than to help them treat something about them that is not good.
I have to tell you this experience I had last week where we were evaluating an individual that was setting fires everywhere, and it was as a result of a delusional process, right? He thought he was getting energy, and the prison sentence for arson is pretty high. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And we had this person had a monolingual in another language, and we had a translator that was, I'm a licensed clinician and they were a licensed clinician too. This person was experiencing overtly psychotic symptoms. I was watching them respond, talking to himself, laughing, pointing at things. Now, I don't speak his language. It was very apparent to me that this person was in a psychotic state. I passed the translator a note because I'm like, I'm not I don't feel like we're speaking on the same level. I said, is this person hearing voices? Their response to me was, well, they're speaking from their heart.
Right. What got me into treatment long-term finally, after 15 years of briefly being on meds and stopping, a very, very common kind of cliche bipolar tendency. I finally have gotten into treatment for the long term. And what got me there, this was the time when my brother had to come. The reason my brother had to come was I had accused I threatened to kill someone in a, because I was a criminal genius, I put it in a voicemail, which is, I wouldn't recommend to anyone planning on making threats to do it in a voicemail. I'm back on meds and it's weeks later and I'm with a therapist when I'm still therapist shopping and trying to find the right person. And this woman is just like, I told that story and she was like, we've talked about this a few times, but you really haven't talked about your anger towards her. And I said, I was like, oh, it was just delusional thinking. I really genuinely believe that she was trying to harm me. It's very common. I think she's like, oh, no. I don't mean your anger when you threatened her. I mean your anger towards her now for threat. Because what had happened was that she had said, like, I'm going to call the cops. Like she had said, like, if you do go to the hospital tomorrow, I might still call the cops, but if you don't go to the hospital, I'm definitely going to call the cops. Is what she said. So that's what I got, and I was literally, I didn't have some sort of come to Jesus. Oh, I know I need treatment now. I was literally dodging the cops. And so, but this therapist was just like, you must be so angry at her for that. I'm like, the fuck are you talking about? I threatened to kill her based on nothing. And so she said she was going to call the cops and you want me to like excavate my anger towards her? Like, I'm very, very grateful to her because, number one, she could have just called the cops, in which case I would have gone to jail. Or number two, she could have ignored it, in which case, who knows what I would have done next, But it's like, and it's just like she was very fixated on this. And it's like, like, not everything I've done as a result of my mental illness is valid. In fact, pretty much all of it has been really invalid, including threatening people's lives. And it's just baked in sense that, like, if I'm in the therapeutic process and I'm telling my truth or whatever, and we're talking about it, I have to have this self-exonerating feeling of like, oh, I was mistreated. No, I threatened to kill someone and she responded appropriately, and I'm glad that she did because it saved my life. Right. But there's just there's just such this built-in sense of like your mental illness comes out of you. Therefore, it is something that is you and is therefore valid and needs to be honored. And that is fanning out. And again, like this is not just an online thing. Like I see it more and more often everywhere within these things. And, let's like that hearing voices thing in the New York Times. I don't mean to sound dramatic, but sooner or later, right, someone who needs a doctor, someone who needs someone who's willing to be adversarial is instead going to get someone who considers themselves an activist. They're going to get pushed into a program like that when it's completely inappropriate for them to be in a program like that. So they won't get medicated. And then they're going to go and kill somebody, right? And that person will be dead. And the person who did the killing's life will be over because they're going to spend the rest of their life in an institution. Like sooner or later, that's going to happen. And the deeper that this goes, I mean, I push people all the time. You need to go in. You need to get medicated. You need to take your pills. I always tell people that I have like a really like wild, contrarian, counterintuitive approach to mental health, which is you should see your psychiatrist, take your pills, and do your therapy. And I tell people that all the time, but as time goes on, I become more and more afraid that they're going to find the wrong person who are coming out of these schools of social work and these schools of nursing or whatever, getting their heads stuffed with all of this social justice stuff, and they're going to find the wrong person who's going to actively keep them from getting the help that they need.
I'm trying not to do that. Sorry, I just want to let you know I'm actively trying to change that.
You kind of anticipated a question I wanted to ask, which is like, to what extent can we just blame not maybe like blame, but like how much of this is just the fault of like academia and especially these professional schools?
I mean, look, this is one of the most annoying kind of problems, which is that I can't just get mad because I know people actually, people actually think they're doing the right thing. I'm sure the guy who wrote that New York Times piece is someone who genuinely, I mean, I think that was all based on his experience with a psychotic brother. And, I have great sympathy for that. I just think that they're powerfully irresponsible. The thing is like, again, it is a social justice-y sort of a thing. It's very much caught up in disability studies, which is this whole bizarre world. At the same time, there just is this very high level of anti-psychiatric medicine sort of background radiation that exists in the United States. And, I fucking hate One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, right? But like that sort of is sort of like the perception of many, many people who have no exposure to serious mental illness, that, it's actually just a bunch of, misunderstood people who don't happen to march to the right beat for society and who don't, and who need to be set free. Like, that is very, very prevalent in America, even among people, especially among people who have no real exposure to this thing. I compared this to autism. Autism and mental illness are separate things, but I do think that there's this common connection. I mean, a number of the people who wrote to me were the parents of severely autistic children. One of them was a woman who said, my child has to wear protective gear at all times because if he doesn't, he repetitively tries to chew off his fingers and he has serious nerve damage in one of his hands from doing so, right? And she said, and I read books about autism and all that I read are about like how this computer programmer considers it the key to his success, right? That kid doesn't show up in the conversation because a kid who's that severely autistic, who's nonverbal, can't participate in the conversation. And the same thing is happening with mental illness, where it's like, look, if you suffer from ADHD, I have great sympathy for you. I know it can be a very debilitating condition. I hope that you get all the treatment that you want. But like, there's this whole wing of Twitter, which is like ADHD Twitter, which is just people saying, we're the face of mental illness. And it's like, no, the fuck you're not. Okay. But those people are always going to have better ability to influence the conversation than the people. There are people, I'm here in Brooklyn. I'm sure there's someone within a half mile who's severely schizophrenic, who's living under a bridge right now and destroying their body with alcohol, right? That person is not in the conversation to say, hey, guess what? For me, this is not a beautiful journey and it's not me being my best self. I'm suffering.
I always say that the most vulnerable are consistently left out of the discourse about this. And it's all these professionals speaking for them, right? And people who are not, and like you said, it's okay to say that you're not experiencing illness at the same level as, people living under bridges that are trapped by their delusions or drugs and alcohol. You're just not. Mm-hmm. And like you having like neurodivergent in your Twitter bio is not the same. And it's okay to say that. Like, it's just totally different. And
I say that, look, I am a very high functioning person with a psychotic disorder. I have become psychotic several times in my life. I have had violent incidences. I have had long-term stays in mental hospitals. I take a lot of powerful drugs, but I'm a very high functioning person. The fact that I can come on a podcast or write in a newsletter, I understand myself to be part of the high functioning. What I just demand of people is to say that, like, to understand, this relentless bright siding of everything, right? I think I might have mentioned this, or maybe not in that newsletter, but Barbara Ehrenreich is one of my heroes, and she wrote a book called Brightside, which was inspired by the fact that she got breast cancer. And all these people in her life were like, this is going to turn out to be a blessing in disguise. This is going to be this is going to be such a positive experience for you. She's like, the fuck are you talking about? I have cancer and it might kill me, right? But there's this American ethos of like, we just have to find a way to cast everything as something, inspiring and a growth moment. And like, this shit just sucks. It really sucks. I am, I live with the consequences of it every day, even as I'm medicated, because the medication sucks so much. The day that I went into the hospital, I was 177. I weighed 177. 3 months later, I was 235. My hands shake so bad I can't hold a cup of coffee sometimes. I have terrible memory and focus issues. I have gastrointestinal problems that are often sufficiently bad that I'm afraid to leave the house. Just it sucks. But it's still better than the alternative, because the alternative is things will seem really cool for a little while. I'll lose weight. I'll be very productive. And then slowly, imperceptibly, I will start to decide that people around me are trying to impede my amazing plan, that I have some sort of, that I'm meant for something more. And that the only reason I'm not doing it is because, my girlfriend, she's up to something. And then I become a violent and scary person. Right. And so that can't happen. And there's just nothing good about it. And I don't need anyone else to bright side it for me.
There's got to be a way that we recognize people's humanity without, infantilizing them or romanticizing the pain that they're in. I see this a lot also with people experiencing extreme poverty and living in squalor. It's like, you can't walk in and judge how they live. Who are you? Who are you to decide that, this person who's living on the street and shitting on themselves, that's their alternative life choice. And what do you know about it? I don't understand how the two are mutually exclusive. It is because I see their humanity that I know that they deserve better than this, and that I want to give them the ability to live a safe and happy life.
There is a thing. I do think that there's this weird way in which it might be the influence of the internet or something, but I think people feel the need to sort of construct a self out of a set of attributes that are very sort of discrete and easily sort of translated to other people. Because, in real life, you can actually get to know someone, but online, you just have to have these avatars of yourself that sort of say, here's who I am. Here's the thing. One of the weird little changes, and look, I'm not judging, and whatever helps them, but, in my bipolar support groups, nobody just wants to call themselves bipolar anymore. Okay. When I first, in a group therapy, within institution group therapy perspective, typically you're just thrown in with everybody. I've never been in a bipolar specific group in an institution. It's, people who are on the ward, whatever, so you might have schizoaffective and schizophrenic, but in these bipolar specific spaces, when I started, you often wouldn't even say bipolar 1 or bipolar 2, even though the distinction has existed for a long time. Now I do my support groups, and it's when people do their opening introduction, it's I'm bipolar with psychotic features. I'm bipolar with ultra rapid cycling. I'm bipolar plus mood disorder, otherwise non-specified. I'm bipolar dominant schizoaffective. It's everybody has to have their own flavor or whatever. And I understand it, but it's I think it speaks to sort of saying this desire to see yourself as your condition. And I have no desire to see myself as my condition, because it's the worst thing about me. And it's, come very close to ruining my life on multiple occasions.
I've noticed a lot where people who are clearly high functioning, they have, good professional jobs, public profiles, I'm sure everybody, they have their troubles, and they will identify very kind of forwardly and forthrightly with such and such mental health condition. I guess the question is, do you think anybody is kind of claiming something that they don't really have, kind of stealing valor, or kind of cloud chasing? Do you think that's a phenomenon going on in the professional classes at all?
Could be. It wouldn't surprise me. You can't operate that way. I think as on a level of just being basically humane and compassionate, and also, from the perspective of building a healthy community for people who suffer from these things, I think that I would never accuse anyone of that. And I always take care to say that I respect the fact that, so many people have anxiety and depression. That sounds awful to me, man. I mean, that seems like a really terrible combination. That must be awful. My issue is not that people are actively faking, and it's not even that people are sort of dominating the conversation based on, disorders I find frivolous or whatever. My problem is like, this stuff shouldn't be aggregated in the first place. So I wrote something and I talked about neurodiversity and I included mental illnesses. And a bunch of people complained and said, that's not what neurodiversity is. But in fact, according to the person who invented the term, it was designed specifically to be as inclusive as possible. And there's all sorts of official organizations who use that. And so, again, like these parents of kids with severe autism, I mean, there's a whole, like 1/2 of kids with serious autism have debilitating seizure disorders as well. They're extremely commonly comorbid with each other. Seizure disorders that can, dictate what they can and cannot do in their lives, even apart from their autism, whatever. And you have a lot of autistic people who are totally nonverbal, who never speak or write in a day in their life, who can't control their own bathroom function, etc. To me, those things should just not be aggregated with a programmer who sometimes can't look people in the eye and feels out of step in social situations. And it's the same way with this stuff where it's like, I respect and value, your OCD and your need for treatment. There are some good drugs for OCD. I hope that you're on them. And I know that it must be difficult for you and I want to help make your life better. It does not make any sense for you to be participating in a conversation about, for example, people with severe schizophrenia, right? I mean, like, there's a whole class of people left out of this too. Like, not to make the conversation too long, but like negative symptom schizophrenia, which is people whose schizophrenia does not represent itself as being actively delusional and outwardly, energetic and all that stuff, but just the opposite, who are very, very withdrawn, who move slowly, talk slowly. Sometimes they reach states of actual catatonia where they're basically unmoving whatsoever. That's like a really significant portion of the schizophrenic population, right? How can they live with the voices, right? Like it's what you're saying. If you're saying that they're going to go completely untreated, is like so they can live with the voices. Well, they're not living with the voices. They're just withdrawing from life entirely. Like, are they part of your thing? It's just this urge to say all things are the same thing is just not useful to me. Like, we all have very different conditions and they have different etiologies and require different treatment plans.
Yeah. Most of the people I actually work with are negative symptom people suffering from negative symptoms because they're gravely disabled. Mm-hmm. I mean, nobody includes them in the conversation, and not because they can't. I think sometimes I wonder if it's just too difficult to see. These are people who will not eat, and I've literally seen people who haven't moved and their arm is like black from lack of circulation and like amputation. Like, mm-hmm. that's what we're talking about, and it's just not the same thing. It's just right. Simply isn't. And it needs, and like you said, two things can be true at once. Your pain is valid, your experience is valid, but let's not equate the two. It's just not the same.
But I mean, I think it also gets back to this, the romanticization of mental illness in American life, which is like, Angelina Jolie's character from Girl Interrupted, right, is someone suffering from a serious mental illness, but she's very glamorous and cool, and everybody on Tumblr wants to be like her, right? So, that vision of what mental illness is very overrepresented. It does not look cool to be someone who has been in an institution for 30 years, who sort of sits sort of mutely in a corner and has to be taken into the shower by staff and who, can barely feed themselves. That's not sexy or cool. And so it's just written out of the conversation.
The people that I serve will continue to suffer. There'll be people coming in between me and the help that I'm trying to give them. Not that I'm so special, but just at least some attempt to allow them not to die a painful, slow death on the street. Because it doesn't look the way that you wanted it to. I'm sorry. I've literally had activists tell me, well, this is triggering to me. This isn't even about you. This is, right. You are not in this. What about the person that is experiencing this intervention? Is it triggering to you if I let them die? We had a person who had a gangrenous infection that needed to go to the hospital. We were actually in the street with a psychiatrist, which is very rare, I'm sure. Do you know? The psychiatrist said, this person, I think, is going to die. Like, they need to go now. And it took a forced intervention. Someone literally said, well, I am so triggered by what I just saw. I said, what?
Right.
Would you have been more triggered if you had tripped over her body when you were walking down the street?
Freddie, maybe this is kind of like a overly broad question, but what would you want to change, right? For people who are coming out of social work schools and, other things, I think even law school, even education and stuff like that as well. I mean, what would you kind of want to dispel, or what would you want them to kind of think about differently, to produce better outcomes for people who are living with really severe mental illness?
Well, I mean, one thing that would have been great is if the community mental health centers that have been envisioned in, I keep forgetting the name of the bill, but then the big omnibus 1963 mental health bill, that would have been, a place to go where, unlike most ERs, they would take seriously crisis level mental health situations that are not yet to the point where the person is so actively delusional and psychotic that it becomes appropriate to forcibly inject them. Right. It's widely surmised that JFK was moved to sort of participate in this because he had a younger sister who was clearly suffering from some sort of developmental or cognitive disability from a very early age. And this is, the era of the Blue Bloods where nobody talked about anything, and they're the Kennedys. So her parents had her lobotomized, and it destroyed her. I mean, it was a lobotomy, destroyed her ability to function, whatever. And he felt, a personal desire to sort of fix that and respond to that. Which is nice, but it's so profoundly American to think we're going to close this broken solution to the problem, and then we're going to have faith that the other solution is going to pop up. I think mental health care is, some of the best bang for your buck that you can get in terms of paying for itself, because so often these things represent themselves as crises that are harder to solve, right? The farther down the line someone gets, again, if they have a gangrenous arm or whatever, that's more expensive eventually to treat than if they are being adequately treated for their psychiatric problem, and they can then say, oh, hey, I have an infection, I should get some antibiotics. Some sort of third space. There needs to be a third space that is not an emergency room, where the doctors would really rather not have to deal with you, but that also is not a long-term care facility. I have been in a half dozen psychiatric facilities in my life. Some are better, some are worse. None of them are pleasant. Sometimes the wardies are really nice and collegial. Sometimes they're assholes. It all depends. I don't think that it is. I'm not convinced that you can sort of legislate sort of kindness and compassion into those places. But it would be nice if there was greater consistency from state to state in terms of how the involuntary commitment process works. I also think it would be great if states actually did an audit and said, is any of this actually happening? I mean, you talk to people and it happens all the time where they say, I was sort of told I couldn't leave. I never had a hearing. They never kind of told me when I would get out. They didn't tell me who I can talk to. They didn't tell me how to talk to a lawyer. And then just one day they were like, oh yeah, you can leave anytime you want, but we think you should stay for a little while. That is a very common experience where there just literally is no delineation of rights like that. So I think that's important. And in an ideal world, everyone who called themselves an activist would have to spend time working in a hospital for those who are severely mentally ill. Right, would have to watch people who struggle to feed themselves, clothe themselves, bathe themselves, to observe people who have some sort of defect in their brain that makes them constantly self-injurious, right? So there are people out there who just, if you just let them out, they're going to kill themselves because they just constantly hurt themselves. People who cannot stop flying into psychotic rages. It's a thing that happens, right? It exists. So I would love that. But absent that, I would like to get real about the fact that people do oftentimes become violent as a result of mental illness. So this is one of the things that drives me crazy, which is like, it's you go onto like lefty Twitter, it's completely off limits to say sometimes people have mental illnesses that compel them to act in a violent way. Even though we know that is true, and we've known that to be true for thousands of years, this has become a very controversial thing. And saying those things because that's stigma. We don't stigmatize. We don't want to stigmatize anyone. So they'll throw stats around like, the mentally ill are more likely to be the victims of violence and to commit violence. That's true. What they don't mention is that that's literally true for everyone, because violent crimes are caused by a very small percentage of the population. So it's true for any class of people that you can name that they're more likely to be the victims of violence than to commit violence. It is certainly true that it appears to be a small minority of people with psychotic disorders who act out violently, but they do exist. And I would argue that denying that fact is, number one, just denying reality. And again, go spend time in a psychiatric facility, okay? And you will observe people who have to be restrained because they will kill someone or themselves if they aren't restrained. I mean, I'm sorry if that's damaging to your feelings. But I also think it's really important to recognize that, because like, you risk degrading one of the few things that we do in society for people with severe mental illness, which is providing legal accommodation for the things that they do under the influence of their disorder. I mentioned James Holmes before, right? Killed 12 people. He pled not guilty by a reason of mental defect. For the record, if he had been found not guilty for that reason, he still would have spent the rest of his life in an institution. But he was found guilty instead. So he'll be in maximum security prison for the rest of his life. But the state wanted to put him to death. And he was only saved from death by one juror. There was one juror who said that they didn't want to put him to death because it was clear that he was so severely mentally ill. And what I would ask people is, if you are really going hard on this claim that mental illness never makes people act violently, then what do you do with James Holmes, right? Are you saying that he should have been put to death? Because if mentally ill people never commit acts of violence, then how could that be a reasonable defense for him, right? You never, ever do good for people by lying about the intensity of their problems. And the idea, this tendency to try to treat the severely mentally ill as this as this class that we want to honor and destigmatize and love, has a tendency to become, I'm only going to fixate on the most camera ready and easily sympathized with people who suffer from them. It's the opposite of who needs the most help. Like James Holmes, after murdering 12 people and being in severe risk of being put to death by the state, that's the mentally ill person that needs your sympathy more than anyone. And that's what I worry about, is being degraded.
I just want to express, and not to be social justice about this, but my immense gratitude for your voice in this discourse.
Well, I really appreciate the opportunity to come on. Yeah, and I'm going to keep spreading this gospel, and I'm glad that you guys do too. We need people in the field who are resistant to this ideology, because look, like I do a lot of my research in the field of education, and I sort of saw in real time, in the span of a decade or a decade and a half, how social justice ideas just completely colonized the education departments and the research and the best pedagogical best practices. So I am very afraid of people emerging from programs in nursing, from programs in social work, from programs in psychiatric medicine, thinking that like their job is to validate their patients rather than treat them. But I appreciate you guys, and thanks for having me on.